Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are once again looking at the suggestions which were passed to the developers of December 2019, and after looking at half of the aviation options, it's time in this video to have a look at the other half. Now remember when I talked about how a lot of these aircraft definitely have a bent towards the modern ideas? This is no more encapsulated than in the next vehicle that we have on offer. This is the F-2A support fighter for Japan, and this is from Asian, so thank you for creating this article. But if you don't know what the F-2A is, let's just say if you're a fan of the F-16, this is a slightly better version of it, or at least in certain areas. One thing to understand is the F-2 was brought in to replace the F-1 as the Japanese support fighter. Now what a support fighter is when it comes to Japan is something that is seen as pretty much a vehicle that would support surface fleet and also ground force operations. See it as kind of an attacker role aircraft, but the problem is, since the general beliefs of the JSDF and how they're all set up, it should be seen as more of a supportive defensive fighter instead of an aggressive attacking fighter. And this has been something which has been represented in the aviation part of Japan for a very long time, with stuff such as the F-86F, which was first used as a support fighter and was used to also intercept vehicles. Then, after that, there was the development of the FST-2 Kai, then the F-1 support fighter, which overall it had pretty good payloads, it had a lot going for it in the attacker role, and the only problem was that in the 1980s it had pretty much reached the end of its service life. They tried to expand its service life through a modernization program in the form of the FSX, and the idea was to just keep going with the F1 until they were able to. The problem is though, well, not the problem, but the idea was at the same time as trying to create this modernization program, they would look for other avenues to be able to create a new vehicle, and therefore, as they did with the Phantom and as they did with many other vehicles at the same time, they decided to look abroad for at least advice or ideas, and therefore they had a look at the F-16, the FA-18C, and also the Tornado IDS, which was around at the time. And you also had factories or manufacturers ready to go in the form of Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, and Fuji, which could easily create license produced versions of these, just like they had done in the past for other vehicles. So what happened is the FSX kind of went forward, but they needed to import an engine from the US, but by that time the US-Japan trade friction meant that it was difficult. So instead of trying to develop this FSX idea, they switched to a different idea, which was taking plans that were based on the F-15 and the FA-18, which at the time were too expensive, and then decided to develop off the base of the F-16. The first prototype was built on the 7th of October 1995, and it was delivered to TRDI. There was a single-seat version in the form of the XF-2A, and then a twin-seat version called the XF-2B, and when they were both in service, these were known as the F-2A and the F-2B. And there was a plan to build about 141 of these aircraft, but the final results were only 94 during 1996 and 2006, and this vehicle is used presently today for Japan. So this is a fully modern vehicle which is used today. So isn't that a wonderful thing? The other thing to also mention is there is actually in this article a lot of really nice pictures, so if you're interested in this aircraft, I would definitely say, give it a look, even if you just want to have a look at the pictures of it. So the other thing to also mention when it comes to it is obviously this is based upon the F-16, the American plane, and there are differences between it though, and normally these come in the form of modernization options. So it has new avionics, it has an active phased ally radar and a mission commuter, etc., all of that stuff. They also changed the shape of the nose, nose, has a new reinforced canopy. The change of the main wing, they created a larger wing area, integrally molded carbon fiber reinforced plastics. They added a radar absorbent material on the front end of the main wing. They added a drag chute as well. They equipped improved an engine, which was the F-16C Block 40 F-110G100, which had 125 kilonewtons on it. And then they also had for the F-2A, you had the F-110IHI-129, which had 131 kilonewtons, so they increased the power a little bit. They expanded the length of the body and also increased its fuel load. They applied new structure technology for the body and the tall wing, and they added the main wing hardpoint to it as well. If you want a general look at the differences between the two, you can see this picture right here, which hopefully, gives it away. So you have the F-16 here, and here's the F-2A. So the F-2A is generally a larger aircraft overall, which, has a bunch of, as I've said, modernization. I suppose you'd class it as a modernization package added to it. Then, if you just look at its general armaments, it has access to, of course, a 20mm as its gun in the front, the JM61A1, the 20mm Balkan cannon. Then it has access to some AAMs in the form of AIM-9Ls, the Type 90 air-to-airs, which we had a look at before, and the Type 04 air-to-airs as well, which are AAM-5s. Middle-range AAMs as well, in the form of the AIM-7M Sparrow, then Type 99 air-to-air missiles, and also the air-to-air missile B Type 99. Also has access to some ASMs, so air-to-ship missiles, bombs as well, and also rockets. So this thing can pretty much carry whatever it wants, and being a support fighter, or as we know it, an attacker, it makes sense too. So that is the first vehicle. In the second part, you can definitely see it is a little bit spicy and would be a hell of a increase in power if it came to the game tomorrow. The next article is from I Am Bob 224, and it's talking about a reworked PROC part of the tech tree. And if you don't know what this is for, this is of course for the Chinese tech tree, and the idea is to add, more planes to it and also just reorganize it a little bit. In this video, we're going to focus on the general way that, we're going to focus on the vehicles that, he wants to add. There's also some other stuff such as renaming, which is involved in this, and also his general opinion on where these machines should be ranked, and also the BRs, but understand to take those ideas with a pinch of salt. The first vehicle to have a look at is the Zong 28YI, and this is a Chinese-built biplane. It was actually the Chinese airplane made in the first aircraft factory. It was built between 1938 and 1943, and it was based off the I-152. It had access to a Wright SR 1820 F-53 engine, and also four 7.62mm machine guns. Had a three-bladed propeller, you can see here, pointed out in the picture. It had a different rudder, tail wheel instead of a ski, and then also a flap in the lower wing, and a difference in engine exhaust, showing that it is different to the I-152 that you will be used to seeing when it comes to historical photos. So that would be in rank 1. The next vehicle to have a look at is also one which is not copied and pasted 3 times, but definitely is incredibly similar. So the Zong, if I mispronounce these, I apologize, but to me it's the Zong. I'm guessing it's probably something like Shong or something like that. The 28G01, and this is a Chinese plane which is based off the I-16 UTI-1, and the Soviets didn't want to provide the Chinese with the expertise to build their own planes, but they were completely fine with, giving them their planes, and then eventually the Chinese managed to build 120 copies of the I-16 during the Sino-Japanese War, which shows the ingenuity that they had at the time. And the Zong 28G, as I'm going to call it, was built in the second aircraft factory located in a large natural cave. Now, there are 3 versions. You've got the 1, the 2, and then also the 3. The differences between them are pretty much armament based. So they all have access to the Wright R1820 Cyclone with 715 horsepower, which gives you a speed of 450 kilometers an hour, but the Zong 28GL1 has access to two 12.7mm Colt machine guns, so of course US made. The second one, the 2, has access to a 20mm, the Madsen cannon, which is actually a Danish 20mm, and then the third version has access to two 20mm Madsen cannons, so therefore they're just going to get heavier as they go along, and unfortunately the flight performance will take a hit, but it'll still be nice to see. The next vehicle is the Yak 9U, and this was actually used, or well, might have been used by North Korea. So this is the first one which is kind of interesting in its story, because we're unsure how many of these were actually used. As it says here, it's unknown how many Yak 9Us operated in North Korea, but it is documented that this aircraft above operated, but in an unknown unit, however. So the belief is that the Yak 9U did serve in North Korea. The only problem is there doesn't seem to be any proof of it, at least that has been found. This, the Yak 9U is of course already in the game in the Soviet tech tree, has access to the Klimov VK-107A with 1650 horsepower, and also the 20mm Shevak and two 12.7mm Berezins. If you've ever played it in the game, it's a pretty nice aircraft. I generally enjoy it, and hopefully, you know, it would be nice to chuck it in a different tree. It is North Korean, so therefore, you know, a lot of people might be annoyed by the fact it goes into the Chinese tech tree, at least by Bob's standards, and it is how it is. I'm not going to comment either way on if I believe it should be or not. I'm just here to present the information, ha ha ha. Actually, no, I'm going to give my opinion. These shouldn't be in the Chinese tree. The Yak 9P is the next one. This one has a much less sketchy history, so it is definitely confirmed that these served in China and then later in North Korea, but they were actually used by the Soviets, which were actually put in there. And you can actually see also that China used their Yak 9Ps from 1946 during the last years of the Civil War, and the aircraft was poorly maintained and the ill-trained pilots were suffering heavy losses, but still highly contributed to the Chinese Red Army's victory over the Republican Chinese, who were supported by the USA. So in North Korea, the information, once again, is pretty spare, what a surprise, and they did use so many Yak 9Ps. Some of them were captured by the US and scrapped, and the Korean Yak 9P was so poorly maintained as the Chinese, was just as poorly maintained as the Chinese, sorry, but still highly contributed to the success of the first part of the Korean War. And obviously it has access to the VK-107A, so the same engine, but one 20mm B-20M and two 20mm B-20Ss, so therefore an increase in power. And I may have actually got these two mixed up. So the Yak 9P was used by the Chinese, not the Soviet forces in China. The LA-11, though, was slightly different. So the LA-11 came to China under the banner of Russia, or the Soviets at the time, in the early 1950s. The 106th Aviation Division was moved to Shanghai to defend the Chinese Red Army airspace against the ROCAF, and a few encounters with Americans made the airplane, resulted in a few ROCF planes being shut down, and soon after the move, which I'm guessing means destroyed, soon after the move of the Russian division, China bought some of these, the 163 LA-11s, on their own. So the Chinese did operate these, but the origin of these vehicles is they came from the Soviets, who were there to protect their interests in China. This had the ASH-82FN engine, 1850 horsepower, and also three 23mm NS-23s, which if you've ever used in the game are incredibly deadly. Rank 5 gives us our first jet, and this is not one to be happy about. It's definitely one which I would say has its issues, mainly because it is a training aircraft. So this is a single-engine, two-seat jet trainer. It is Its name is the Delphin, or the L-29, and what it has access to in the forms of weaponry is not great. So it's in the engine power department, it has the motorlet M701C500 turbojets. This gives it a max speed of around about 656 kilometers an hour, which is pretty pitiful for a jet, but overall you do have to remember this is a trainer. When it comes to its armament, it has two choices. It either could carry two 7.62mm machine gun pods or 8 air-to-ground rockets without the guns, or 200 kilo bombs. There was 4 of them, which were used by the Chinese. The country of origin was Czechoslovakia, and this is in the late 60s. So you can see the development of machines was a little bit behind when it came to the Chinese, but they still got around to it. So yeah, this thing would have either 2 7.62mm machine guns on it, or 8 rockets. I know what I'm picking. I'm definitely picking the guns, but I do also think that if we have a look at its general armament, it might not be high enough to add it to the game at the level specified. The JJ-1 is the next vehicle that is on offer. The JJ-1 was a vehicle produced by the Shenyang Aircraft Development Office. The idea was to create a new jet based on what they knew and also on the resources available. So when it was accepted by the committee, the technical drawings went to the manufacturing department to build the first prototype, and the result was a pretty efficient and completely Chinese-built jet. In the end, the JJ-1 was never put into production because the PLAAF concluded that it would be impossible for pilots to make an immediate transition from propeller airplanes to jet aircraft, and also propeller aircraft were concluded to provide sufficient ground support. So therefore, China's second aircraft endeavor came to a quiet ending. But they did build it. It was successful. It's also incredibly ugly, so you can, take that from it as well. But the main thing to understand is it had one 23mm cannon. It could go 840 kilometers an hour, and this, when it comes to time period, was early 1950s. It didn't have any secondary armaments though, since it was just a prototype, so therefore you have to take that into account. Now we get into some more Soviet machines. This is the J-5. This is a Chinese-built single-seat jet interceptor. It's a licensed version of the MiG-17F. It's as simple as that. So you get to see that machine in the tree. Has a 37 and also two 23s to it, and they made 767 of them license built in China in the 1950s. Then you got the J5A. This is a license built version of the MiG-17PF, and as usual, just a straight copy, but made in Chinese hands. This had 3 23mm on it, a bunch of rocket pods, and also 250 kilogram bombs. What is also interesting is it did have a fire control radar installed. You can see this interesting front, which definitely looks very ugly, but is obviously made for a purpose. And also the first PF was not flown until 1964, and all the MiG-17 PFs became the J5A in service. So they didn't just, build them, they also just moved over the other ones as well. The J6C as well. This is a better version of the standard J6. The brake parachute was relocated from its ventral compartment to a prominent bullet-shaped fairing at the base of the fin, and the reason for the modification was that the original brake parachute caused the aircraft to pitch down sharply, so it should be easier to land. And also it still had access to the 330mm cannons and the 2 WP6A engines. The J7 is a license-built version of the MiG-21. Obviously, with so many variants of the MiG-21 around, there was also a billion variants of the J7 as well. It had access to the Liang Wappen 13F afterburning turbojet, which is a really cool name, if I'm quite honest prowess. It definitely rolls off the tongue very well. And also two 30mm Type 31 cannons and a bunch of different armament loadouts because of the fact that it had 5 hard points. Also had access to a bunch of different radars as well, once again depending on which one you wanted to pick. And as a premium, the JJ5. Now this is a definite ugly duckling, but this is a J5 which was designed to have a twin-seat cockpit in it and would also be used for export. So that is, you know, something to look forward to. The fact that it was a twin-seat trainer version would mean that it would be ideal for premium status, because it's kind of similar to another one of the tech tree vehicles, but also, you know, different enough for people to be interested, and its armament though is very much severely lacking. So even though it has the WP5D, which gave it a speed of 1,048 kilometers an hour, it only had one 23mm, the Type 23-1, and two 250 kilo bombs under the wings. So yeah, that's a bit of a problem when it comes to it. And also the J5 airframe was combined with the J5A air brakes and the tandem twin-seat cockpit section of the JJ2, which was of course the MiG-15 UTI. So yeah, very, very interesting machine. Hopefully it is one of those which eventually makes it in the game in some form of premium. The next vehicle we're having a look at is the Reggiane, and this is from Milocat, and the Reggiane is a beautiful machine. This is the 2003 version, and there was only a single prototype made. This is, of course, a fighter, bomber, and reconnaissance aircraft. It was supposed to replace the outdated IMAM RO-37 biplane, and which had been the Regia Aeronautica's long-standing scout plane of choice. The 2003 was designed from the 2002, and it featured a lengthened canopy because they wanted to add a second crew member to serve as the observer, and modifications to the airframe which allowed it to carry cameras. It also retained the armament of two 12-7s and two 7-7s from the 2002, and also the ability to carry a 500 kilo bomb. There was one prototype which was constructed. It first flew in June of 1941, and the Italians wanted to, or put in an order for 200 examples, but this was cancelled in 1942 when the Reggiane refocused its efforts to produce more fighters to defend Italy's skies. So therefore it didn't really get off the ground. It would be nice to have in the game, just because it's another Reggiane to add to that wonderful line, which is really, really fun to play. The next vehicle that is on offer is the Super-Etendard, as you can see here, and the Super-Etendard is a beautiful aircraft. We just got the Etendard, didn't we? Yes, for the French tree, so this would be a kind of a step up, but at least it's being considered. So the Super-Etendard, or the Dassault Super-Etendard, yes, I'm going to keep making fun of the name, is a French Navy fighter attacker aircraft. It was made to be able to be launched from French aircraft carriers. This article was also from Trotrodor, which is a very hard name to say, and it was made to replace the French Etendard, the IVM, and also the F-8 Crusader, which the French operated. It was chosen over the competition, which was actually a Jaguar M, which was a navalized version of the Jaguar, which I've never heard of, but does sound really, really interesting. It was powered by an ATAR 8K50, a non-afterburning engine, and is also equipped with a new Agave radar optimized for air-to-sea combat and made to be equipped with modern weapons such as the AM-39 Exocet missile. And the first prototype was made its first flight in 1974, and the first series aircraft made its first flight in 1977. It was finally put into service for the French Army in 1978 on the aircraft carrier the Clemenceau and the Foch, and later on the Charles de Gaulle. And it also entered service with the Argentinians in 1981. So even though this machine was very much specialized to deal with air-to-sea missions, it was also able to do ground attack, fire support, air combat, recon, and also nuclear attack missions. The main selling point of this machine, though, is of course its naval aspects. The fact that it's able to carry this ridiculous, basically the missile, the AM-39, the Exocet anti-shipping missile, is one of those really big selling points. It also had two 30mm DEFAs with 125 rounds per gun. When it comes to its maximum speed, it was 1,203 kilometers an hour, and also it had in hardpoint style 6, 4 under wings and 2 under fuselage, with a capacity for around about 2,100 kilos worth of bombs. It could also carry Matra rocket pods, SNEBs, the Air Sol Moyen Portée nuclear armed missile, the AS-30Ls, and also the Matra Magic air-to-air missiles, which at some point I would love to see in the game. It also could carry a nuclear bomb. So there you go. How fun would that be? Just a big old bomb thrown around the place. So the next article is an incredibly long one, and this is from Kiev, and it outlines pretty much everything when it comes to the Saab Drakon J35. Now, the Drakon is one of those machines which most people are hoping will eventually come to the top ranks of the Swedish tech tree, and I'm sure it will. When we go into the new year, I'll be incredibly surprised if we don't see more of these machines. But I would just like to point out this article is incredibly long, and the way that it's actually written is very hard to follow, meaning that there are certain parts which don't really feel like they're copied, but what I mean is they don't really follow along from each other, and it's very hard to read. So the main thing to understand is if the sources at the bottom are incredibly good, they actually give you all the information you require, and also if you want a general history on where this thing came from, the article gives it. So the first thing to understand is in 1949, the Flygvapen, which was the Swedish Air Force, they opened competition for a design to replace the J-29. And the new aircraft, what they wanted it to hit Mach 1.4 and also 1.5 in level flight, and then eventually they extended that to 1.7 and then to 1.8. So they wanted a vehicle in 1949 to go 1.8 Mach. And to understand how much of a step this was, they went from the J-29, which had only flown a year earlier in September the 1st, 1948, and there was no other device in the world that would have this kind of wing operating conditions, because of course they wanted not just the fast speed, but also to keep this delta wing idea that they were looking at. At the time, the F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15 were just beginning to be delivered to their units, and the Swedish Air Force had already required a speed which would be greater than 50% of the speed of those vehicles. The Swedish were just not mucking about. They wanted to create something fast, and they knew how to do it. So the fact is, when the F-100 Super Sabre turned up in 1953, it was decided that the Drakon, which obviously wasn't called at the time, would have a very high ascent rate and also ability to operate on the same tracks as the J-29. This meant that in addition to conventional fields, it would also be able to use stretches of 2,000 meter long road, some 25 meter and 30 meter wide to be able to take off. The other thing as well is when it came to the Saab project team, which took up the mantle of building this machine, it was led by a guy called Eric Bratt. Now, Eric Bratt is an incredibly clever man. This should not be mistaken as anything other than praise. Eric Bratt, if you look at the history of him, it was just insane what he was able to do. The idea was to combine the Rolls-Royce Avon turbine with afterburners and also a low drag aerodynamic drag. So this reduction in drag would mean that the maximum cross-section of the aircraft was minimized, also employed thinner wings within the construction techniques of the time, so therefore it would be able to slice through the air a hell of a lot easier than other conventional designs. So after bringing along all of these ideas, they created a concept in the form of what was known as the Lil Drakon, which is a great name. And this was first of all started as an 8th scale model, which was used in a aerodynamic tunnel to test ideas, and then eventually they built a crew model which was 70% the size of what you see today. And if you want a picture of it, this is basically what it looked like, the Lil Drakon, the experimental aircraft which they used. This went into this went into the 1950s, where eventually they created the Saab 210, which was the project in May 1950, and that flew on February the 21st, 1952, and about 1,000 flights with the technology being demonstrated and working out, making sure to get the fuel in the correct place, to change the center of gravity so that, the plane would be good, and also with the wing configuration that was created. All of this came together in order to build and create this new design, which eventually, would end up in the Saab 210, and the Saab 210, if I can just find the picture of it, here it is, right here, is what it eventually looked like, at least from below. So you can see that, the Lil Drakon, which was the Saab 210, was a success after so many, after so much testing and being able to go through it and iron out all the kinks. And then they took even more high-speed tests. So they did some tests in the supersonic tunnels, which some of them actually happened in the US. The double delta idea finally gained confidence, and the Swedish authorities ordered the assembly of a mock-up aircraft, which would be a real-scale model that was not intended to fly, so it wouldn't be the prototype, but they would understand what it would look like. The J-35 in March 1952 would be created, which was this mock-up, and of course the J-35 eventually moving into what we know as the Drakon. So after this mock-up was created, there was a contract signed for 3 prototypes and 3 pre-series airplanes. The first would be the Saab 35. This flew on the 25th of October 1955, and then in parallel, the situation of the other Western supersonic fighters at the time. You had the F-100 in 1953, the F-104 and the F-102A in 1954, the Mirage 3A and the F-106 in 1956, and the Lightning in 1957. So the Saab was closest to the Americans and leading in the European industry, showing that the Swedish were ahead at the time when it came to high-speed flight. So therefore, they demonstrated the vehicle a lot. And after the 3 prototypes were built, they were given the Avon turbine engines, the Rolls-Royce ones that we talked about before. And from there, after a bunch of testing, especially during 1956, the Drakons were fabricated with Avon impellers produced under license from the Svenska Flygmotor, or the Volvo Flygmotor, which also developed a post-burner capable of thrust much larger than the British design. So they took the British design and improved on it. Except for the shape of the wing, the Drakon was pretty much a conventional fighter. It had fully servo commands, redundant hydraulic systems, and an energy blower for impact air to provide pressure in case of a turbine failure. So, it pretty much had passed all of its trials. It had become incredibly fast, and, they decided to finally put it into production. The speed eventually, when it came to the J-35A, which was the first proper production version of this aircraft, eventually hit Mach 1.8, and the Drakon also had an armament of 2 30mm on the leading edges, and also a bunch of other stuff such as the RB-24s, which are the AIM-9B sidewinders, and could also carry a bunch of bombs and stuff. You can see in the picture here what it was able to carry, which is just absolutely insane if you generally think about it. So there was also obviously a bunch of different weapon configurations that you can find here as well, with the forms of the Yakans and the RB-24s, and there was a bunch of different there was a bunch of different variants of the Drakon made, and generally what was happening was they were changing its performance and also changing what general guns that it used. So even though the J35A used 2 Aiden 30mm, once you get to the later variants of it, such as the F actually only has 1 Aiden. It also has the Flig motor RM6C, which gave it 7,830 kilos worth of thrust, and also a maximum speed of around about Mach 2, when, you know, it didn't have any missiles on board. When it actually had 4 missiles, it was generally at Mach 1.7, which it was able to create. So you had all of these different versions of the Drakon. Hopefully at some point, you know, we get them all into the game, but if you want to learn more about the specific variants instead of the history on how it came out, I would advise you to read this article. It's a long one, but it's definitely worth it. The next one, and the last one to have a look at, is the Skyhawk. But this is not the conventional Skyhawk that you are used to. This is from Josh Wagstaff 13, and it is a New Zealand version of the Skyhawk. So let's go through it, because the history of it is actually really cool, and it should definitely be talked about. So in 1970, 10 A4Ks and 4 dual-place TA4Ks were delivered to New Zealand off the helicopter carrier, the USS Okinawa. This was to actually replace the RNZAF's aging Canberra fleet, and they were derived from the basic A4F airframe. But due to budget restraints, they were built and delivered with a downgraded and slightly different avionics suite compared to the A4F. But they were still seen as capable aircraft, and also were assigned to the number 75 squadron of the RNZAF. Now, in 1984, something happened with the Australian boys. So the Royal Australian Navy, they retired its last carrier, which was the HMAS Melbourne, and the fleet of the A4G Skyhawks that were operated by the RAN FAA, they were retired from service and offered for sale. So some of these aircraft were sold to the New Zealanders to supplement the A4Ks, and this created a slight problem for the New Zealanders because the A4Gs, they actually had different avionics. They also had no dorsal fuselage hump, no braking chutes compared to the ones that they already had. So therefore, in 1983, there was a defense review which outlined an ambitious project to upgrade the A4K fleet, and these new acquisitions from the Royal Australian Navy were included in the plan as well, which would bring all of the Skyhawks in the New Zealand Air Force to a common standard. So instead of just having A4Ks lying around and also A4Gs, what would happen is they would bring them all together under one idea, so therefore, you know, everything would have standards. You know, they would have a general baseline instead of having a system where, you know, you have to have different systems for different beliefs. So the project, which was, of course, you know, what would formalize all of these things, was called KAHU. KAHU, and it was a significant modernization and upgrade packages which were ever implemented. So this was the most significant one which was ever implemented to any member of the A4 family. It saw the avionics built in the 1960s replaced with some of the newest hardware that New Zealanders could get their hands on, effectively giving an old subsonic attack jet the eyes, ears, and most of the teeth of a 4th generation multi-role fighter, such as the FA-18 or the F-16. So what they added to it is the AN/APG-66NZ, which was the radar from an F-16A and B. This replaced the AN/APG-53A ground mapping radar. They added the Ferranti 4500 series HUD. the ANALR-66 radar warning receiver system, the ANALE-39 countermeasure dispensing system with a pair of chaff and flare dispensers. They upgraded pylon electronics to allow the aircraft to fire AIM-9L sidewinders and AGM-65Bs and G Mavericks. Ooh, that'd be fun. Data link capabilities. They upgraded the radios compatible with NATO encryption protocols, and also they upgraded the IFF and the addition of ILS receivers. So they pretty much just changed all the insides and the electronics and brought them up to an incredibly high standard compared to what this machine was used to. So the first upgraded aircraft flew in 1987, and the last one eventually rolled out of the hangar in 1991. So the project was completed in 1991. All of these Skyhawks flew with the New Zealand Air Force until 2001, and they were retired without replacement. There was a deal to replace them with F-16s, but it was cancelled by the incoming government. So most of the aircraft went to museums. Some of them were sold to Drakon International, which uses them to provide dissimilar air combat training to pilots flying aircraft such as the F-15, 16, 22, and of course 35. So they're still around, you know, but unfortunately not in active service, but it is how it is. So the main notes to talk about is the armament that is on the machine. It has two fixed 20mm Colt Mark 12s, which you should be, used to by now in the game. And then also it has access to an AIM-9L Sidewinder and the LAU-7 missile launch rail, the AGM Mavericks, of course, the 19 rocket launchers for the CRV 770mm, also a Mark 82 500-pound, unguided bomb. Those are for the outboard stations 1 and 5, and then 2 and 4 you have similar stuff, apart from the fact that they can have different or slightly different types of bombs on them as well, including the GBU-16 1,000-pound laser guided bomb, and then the Centerline Station 3. This itself could have bombs or rockets on it as well. So a lot of really interesting stuff, a lot of very, very fun things to think about. The only question is which tech tree do you put it in, and I'm sure most people wouldn't care as long as it came to the game. The maximum speed was 0.89 max. This was not a supersonic vehicle, but still it had a lot of really interesting upgrades to it, and also it would be nice to see New Zealand represented in the game a little bit more, along with Australia as well. So yeah, that is the last vehicle for the aircraft, and you can see that it has definitely been a lot of modern stuff and a lot of stuff which is a little bit older but then upgraded to 80s and 90s standards, which is really cool. I hope you've enjoyed these videos. Next time we'll have a look at the ground forces stuff, and well, I'll see you then. Have a lovely day. I'd just like to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Blackie, Chris Giltnane, Daniel Stanton, Jay Wilt, John Ryman, Martinez, Moxie, Super Cacti, Trigger Hippie, Eugens Terry, and also Elove Goat and Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.